For a long time, an atmosphere of confidence, tinged with the scent of oil, prevailed in the corridors of the Kremlin. No matter how many sanctions the West imposed, Russian President Vladimir Putin had two giants to lean on: China and India. These two Asian giants filled the void left by the West after the start of the war in Ukraine, becoming Russia's largest oil customers. So much so that, as of June 2025, more than half of Russia's total fossil fuel exports were going to these two countries. China was buying millions of barrels of Urals oil per day at discounted prices, both fueling its own economy and filling Putin's war chest. India followed a similar path, pushing its energy trade with Moscow to record levels despite pressure from the West. These oil transfers were a lifeline for Putin. Vladimir Putin could send the message to the West: "Look, I'm not alone. Asia is with me." However, this lifeline was punctured in the last week of October 2025, and it came from the most unexpected place: a single order from Washington. It all began with President Donald Trump's harsh statements to reporters aboard Air Force One on October 25, 2025. Trump announced that he had signed a new and much more comprehensive sanctions package targeting Russia's largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. But the real bombshell of this package was that it also directly targeted third-country companies that continued to buy Russian oil. President Trump's message was clear: if you continue to do business with Russia, you will be ostracized from the American financial system and the dollar market. These words were not just a threat, but a direct ultimatum to China and India's state-controlled oil giants, namely Sinopec, CNPC, Indian Oil, and other such players. The effects of Trump's ultimatum were immediate and devastating. As reported by international media agencies starting on October 23, China's state-owned oil giants, Sinopec and PetroChina, suspended imports of crude oil from Russia by sea immediately after the new U.S. sanctions. These companies stopped placing new orders to avoid risk. Shortly thereafter, the news announced on October 26 was even more shocking. India completely halted its purchases of Russian oil. Fearing the wrath of the Trump administration, New Delhi sacrificed its decade-long energy partnership with Moscow overnight. This was a complete disaster for Putin. In just a few days, the Russian president had lost his two biggest customers and two most important allies. Moreover, this blow came not from Ukraine or Europe, but directly from Washington, with a single signature from Trump. This was a shocking demonstration of how ruthless sanctions can be and of the power of the U.S. over the global financial system. So how badly was Russia shaken? To understand the impact of China and India's decisions on the Russian economy and Putin's war machine, one need only look at the numbers. Before the war in Ukraine, Russia earned approximately $1 billion per day from oil and gas exports. Although post-war Western sanctions reduced this revenue, record sales to China and India allowed the Kremlin to continue financing its war. For example, according to a 2025 report by the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, or CREA, Russia was still earning billions of dollars a month from fossil fuel exports, with most of that money coming from Asia. Now, however, these taps have suddenly been turned down or shut off completely. China's significant reduction in purchases and India's complete halt mean a drop of millions of barrels in Russia's daily oil exports. This translates to a loss of billions of dollars per month in foreign exchange earnings flowing into the Kremlin's coffers. So what can Putin do without this money? First, it must be said that Putin cannot finance the war without oil revenues. He will have no money left to fuel the tanks, pay the soldiers' salaries, or buy the parts to produce the missiles. In other words, Russia's war machine will come to a standstill. Second, Russia's budget deficit could likely explode in a short time without oil revenues. The Russian budget was already running a record deficit. This loss of revenue will further increase the deficit and force the Kremlin to either cut social spending, such as pensions and healthcare, or trigger hyperinflation by printing money. With China and India turning their backs on Russia for oil, we may also witness a further collapse of the ruble. With Russia's dollar and euro revenues cut off, pressure on the ruble could increase significantly. This could further increase the prices of imported goods, destroying the purchasing power of the Russian people. In short, China and India turning their backs on Russia poses the risk of a sudden cardiac arrest for the Russian economy. This situation will completely set Putin back, not only in Ukraine, but also in his global competition against the US-EU alliance. However, the crisis is not limited to oil. Trump's sanctions and the fear of secondary sanctions he has created are also poisoning all other strategic relations between China and India and Russia. Arms trade is one of the areas suffering in these relations. India has been one of the largest customers of Russian weapons for decades. However, in recent years, especially since the start of the war, New Delhi has rapidly begun to turn to Western and domestically produced weapons, such as French-made Rafale and American P-8s. The poor performance of Russian weapons in Ukraine and problems with spare part supply accelerated this change. Now, with the added risk of U.S. sanctions, it has become nearly impossible for India to purchase large systems such as the S-400 or new-generation fighter jets from Russia. China, meanwhile, is already developing its own arms industry and is no longer as dependent on Russia for critical technologies as it once was. In fact, China has surpassed Russia in some military areas. This means that arms exports, a major source of revenue for Putin, are about to dry up. The halt of technology and resource transfers can also be mentioned. China and India may now be reluctant to cooperate with Russia in areas such as military technology, space technology, or nuclear energy. This is because such cooperation could make them direct targets of U.S. sanctions. In other words, Russia is losing not only its customers, but also its technological and scientific partners. This situation shows how quickly Russia is becoming isolated on the global stage, and how the former superpower has turned into a risky and unreliable partner that no one wants to do business with anymore. So why did China and India suddenly abandon the balancing act they had maintained for years and bow to Washington's demands? The answer lies in simple pragmatism. In other words, both countries have their own national interests. China's strategic dilemma is the main factor triggering this pragmatism. Since the beginning of the Ukraine war, Beijing has been walking a fine line, not wanting to completely lose Moscow, which it sees as a strategic balancing factor against the West. On the other hand, the Beijing regime did not want to risk its billion-dollar economic relations with its largest trading partners, the European Union and the United States. Trump's new sanctions made this balance impossible. The Chinese Communist Party had to make a choice. Either it would side with a collapsing Russia and risk being excluded from the global economy, or it would protect its own economic interests and distance itself from Moscow. Beijing chose the latter. President Xi Jinping may not want to become an international pariah like Kim Jong-un. His goal is to make China the world's largest economy, and to achieve this, he needs Western markets. So we can say that Xi and Putin's rhetoric of unlimited friendship has evaporated in the face of the greenback. The reason India did not oppose the U.S. ultimatum stems from the clear preference of the country's leadership. The situation was even clearer for India. Although New Delhi has had close military and energy ties with Russia for decades, in recent years it has strategically moved closer to the West, especially the U.S. The Quad alliance is a case in point. India needs Washington's support to counterbalance China's rise. At the same time, New Delhi is dependent on Western technology and investment to grow its economy. However, Trump's sanctions have brought India to a crossroads. The South Asian country would either have to jeopardize its relationship with its most important strategic partner for cheap Russian oil or distance itself from Moscow by prioritizing its economic interests and geopolitical position. India unhesitatingly chose the West. The decision of these two giants revealed a bitter truth for Putin. There is no brotherhood or ideology in international relations, only interests, and Russia no longer has any attractive interests to offer either China or India. On the other hand, Putin, who is losing his allies one by one, whose economy is collapsing due to sanctions and his own mistakes, and whose war machine is running out of fuel and parts, faces a tragic picture after all this. Increasing isolation is one aspect of this picture. Russia may now be ostracized not only by the West, but also by countries it once considered friends. Central Asian countries, African countries, and even Belarus may seek ways to distance themselves from Moscow. Russia could become an isolated power, limited to a few pariah states like North Korea and Iran. The deepening economic collapse of Russia is also part of this picture. Without oil and gas revenues, the Russian economy cannot survive. The country could be dragged into an economic crisis even deeper than that of the Soviet era. Poverty, unemployment, and social unrest are likely to increase significantly. Increased internal pressure is another aspect of the picture painted for Russian leader Putin. Economic hardship and the trauma of war could test the patience of the Russian people. Gasoline queues, empty shelves, and soldiers' coffins arriving from the front could increase internal pressure on the Putin regime. The rifts between oligarchs and elites may deepen. The inevitability of military defeat will also likely haunt Putin. It is impossible for an army that cannot be financed, resupplied, or modernized to win the war in Ukraine. Russia will sooner or later be forced to withdraw from Ukraine in a humiliating manner. As we have seen, China and India turning away from Russian oil is not just an economic event, but also a historic turning point signaling the beginning of the end of the Putin regime. While attempting to conquer Ukraine, Putin has actually strangled his own country economically, lost his allies, and condemned Russia to an isolation that will set it back decades on the global stage. The blow to the heart of the Russian economy, delivered by the turning away of China and India, the two Asian giants Putin trusted most, did not stop at merely changing the course of oil tankers or emptying the Kremlin's coffers. It initiated a much more insidious, much more destructive, and irreversible process of internal decay, an era of self-cannibalization for an empire. The drying up of oil revenues was merely a symptom. The real disease was a much deeper cancer, now sucking the brainpower out of Russia, driving its war machine to self-destruction, and melting Moscow's regional influence like an iceberg. As Putin bleeds in Ukraine, he may not realize until it is too late that the last vestiges of life are now draining from his homeland's veins. A country's most valuable treasure is, but the brainpower of the people who live on that soil. And Putin's war is ripping that treasure from Russia. In the first months of the war, hundreds of thousands of educated Russians left the country for moral reasons or fear of mobilization. But this new wave of economic collapse, beginning with China and India distancing themselves from Moscow, could turn the brain drain from a trickle into a full-blown tsunami. Why? Because it is no longer just a matter of opposition to war or a desire for freedom. The real issue is one of basic survival and hope for the future. An economy collapsing without oil revenues does not just shut down factories. It also renders universities, research institutes, hospitals, and technology companies inoperable. The talented engineers, software developers, and scientists that Russia desperately needs can no longer find the equipment and resources they need to continue their work, which cannot be imported due to both financial and technological sanctions. Their salaries are eroding against inflation, and their projects are being canceled. The choice for them has become simple: either stay in the country and see their talents wither away, or go abroad and take advantage of the opportunities offered to them in Kazakhstan, Armenia, Serbia, and even Western countries. Those who leave are not just individuals, but Russia's innovation capacity, technological future, and even the potential to rebuild its collapsing civil industry. China and India's reduction and complete halt of oil purchases could further exacerbate this brain drain from Russia. While Putin claims to be challenging the West, he is actually gifting his country's most valuable asset, its intellectual capital, to the West and other rival countries. This is an irreparable loss that will last for decades. In other words, Russia may be losing not only its oil, but also its brains. On the other hand, those who do not choose Russia are not limited to people, countries' citizens. Russia was overwhelmingly dependent on the West or on China using Western technology for modern microchips, precision optics, advanced composite materials, and most importantly, the sophisticated machine tools to produce these products. China and India, wary of American sanctions, halting or severely restricting sales of these dual-use products could make it impossible for Russia not only to produce new tanks or aircraft, but even to repair existing ones. Tank factories in Russia could come to a complete standstill due to a lack of engine or transmission parts. Aircraft factories may be unable to complete new jets due to a lack of avionics systems or special alloys. Missile factories may be unable to find critical electronic components due to facilities like Elektrodel, which was hit by Ukraine. Even if production continues, quality inevitably declines. Russia is attempting to produce Frankenstein weapons using low-quality Chinese chips it can find due to sanctions or parts taken from old Soviet-era stockpiles. However, the performance of these weapons is declining, failure rates are increasing, and they are putting the lives of soldiers on the front lines at even greater risk. In modern warfare, technological backwardness means death. As resources become scarce and production inefficient, the cost of each tank and each missile reaches astronomical levels. Without oil revenues, it is impossible for Russia to cover these costs. Thus, the war economy is turning into a monster that can no longer sustain itself, becoming nothing more than a massive black hole. Thank you for watching.